Hello, my name is Ross Bentley. I'm Managing Director of Automation for PK, and I'm your host for today's panel discussion titled Automation is the New Fabric. I'd like to introduce our panelists. First of all, we have Ram Satya, Executive Vice President of Automation for PK, an experienced engineering firm. Next, Leslie Joseph, Principal Analyst from Forrester, industry-renowned thought leader in the automation space, and lead analyst for several Forrester research publications, including The Wave, NowTech, etc. And also we have Marcus Zirn, SVP of Strategy and Business Development for Workato, an automation iPaaS leader recognized by Forrester, Gartner, and several other research as a leader in this space. Today's panel discussion will be about 30 minutes of guided conversation, along with a time of Q&A to follow that. So please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen to submit any questions you would like to ask the panelists, and as we have time, we'll be able to answer those. As you may notice, everyone in this presentation is muted except for the panelists. So if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us directly through the Q&A function. And so to get started, I'm going to hand it over to Ram Satya. Ram, would you take it away for us, please?
Thanks, Ross. Hello, everyone. As we are all witnessing, automation as the top technology trend that is helping transform, irrespective of whether you're digitally native or not. Just in the last few years alone, we have seen a rise of several automation platforms, service players, and whether it is enterprise, small, medium businesses, or any type of verticals, right? We have seen that growing trend. And most interesting thing that we have witnessed is the gap that exists in the whole experience journeys, right? What was, whether it is front office or a back office, the experience journeys has been one of the key recipes for success by using automation. And this, interestingly, also has helped to evolve newer roles. For example, the whole notion towards the digital CFO, which was traditionally a back office leader role, but now it's becoming very, strategic, role, right? Certainly, I think there's a lot of interesting areas that we can look at from both strategy and tactical standpoint. But today, what we want to talk about is what are some of the challenges that the industry is facing, and how our PA platforms are helping to overcome some of those challenges, right? We'll start with from Forrester's perspective, right? We'll ask Leslie Joseph, what are the key challenges with respect to automation?
Sure. First of all, thank you, Ram, and Workato and PK for having me on this webinar. I think it's an interesting question, and I want to address it, I guess, at two different levels. So you specifically asked me the question about robotic process automation. I want to also broaden it out a little bit to talk about automation at large. So I will answer this question at sort of two levels. So first, let's talk about it tactically. So I think I have been covering RPA and the broader process automation space for about 3.5 years. And what I've seen is that different organizations at different levels of scale and maturity, they typically run into different kinds of challenges. So first of all, early stage programs, they typically struggle with establishing the right processes, the right use cases, building pragmatic business cases around these use cases, and sort of realizing the early stage value from automation programs. As they mature out of this level and they start scaling up into slightly more mature programs in terms of both enterprise scale and coverage, as well as in terms of maybe more tactical measures like number of digital workers, a number of processes automated, and so on. At that point, the second level of challenge comes in, which is typically establishing governance. And when you're talking about establishing governance, this is a bunch of things there to unpack, right? Because it's not just about setting up a COE or kind of trying to align to some standards, but it's also about having, converting your in-flight automation program into sort of this enterprise-wide platform that is available across your organization, has consistent standards and outcomes, and is consistently driving innovation across the organization. And I think we've come to a point where many organizations have started to come to some level of reasonable governance. And that's typically where the third, and this is the big one, the third challenge comes up, which is really how do you now take this program, which is functioning at multiple levels in terms of being able to deliver ROI and so on, and now make it or transform it into an enterprise-wide automation culture that is really focused on empowering and not alienating the people, the employees, and so on, and really being this driver for bottom-up innovation. So three things that I said: first, process; second, governance; and third, culture. But then you're still operating at a relatively tactical level, because the goal is really at a higher level, where you start to think about automation and link it up to what it means in the context of digital transformation, in the context of your transformation goals. And that's a bit of a disconnect, especially if you started off fundamentally thinking of automation as a means to mitigate cost or to mitigate risk, and aren't really thinking about it as a strategic enabler of digital differentiation and digital transformation. I like to call this idea automation myopia, which is kind of organizations still struggling with elevating the value and the impact of automation across from an operational level to sort of a more business transformation, business model transformation kind of scale. And that really is a big leap, because it requires a really strong and bold vision from the top, and it also requires creativity from organizational leaders as well as the rest of the organization, and really long horizon thinking, because that's really where automation, the sweet spot, is going to be going forward.
Spot on, Leslie. I think the key message there is, automation is becoming a very fundamental to the financial health as well as the overall operations of all the companies, and we are starting to see that there are some opportunities where they can report how automation can improve the quarter-over-quarter performance and the annual performance and all that. Absolutely. Following up with that, Leslie, where are these enterprise customers in the journey towards digital transformation, and how is automation enabling them? What is your point of view?
You're asking a very interesting question, because you're asking me what the linkage is between digital transformation and automation, right? And that's where I want to. Maybe this will end up being a bit of a story, but if you think about what's been going on in the last maybe couple of decades since we started using the word digital and digital transformation, what we've seen is we've seen the emergence of companies that were natively digital. We used to call them digital natives, we still do. And these were companies that really placed digital technologies and digital innovation at the heart of their business model. And really, a lot of them went on to reshape entire industries. And much of this really, Ram, happened in front of our eyes, right? So we've seen the Googles and the Ubers and the Airbnbs of the world as they came up. But in the wake of these disruptors, we've also seen many traditional firms who've adopted their kind of digital ways of working. And these companies also were really able to survive the disruption that ensued. And some of them were even able to thrive. But then if you cut to today, it's a different environment. The first wave of digital technology, which was really focused on, things like we used to talk about, social, mobile, all of those nice stuff, nice things, those are matured. And with this maturation has come sort of a plateau. Because today where we are is that the opportunities for this sort of breakaway digital differentiation using the first wave of digital technologies has kind of dwindled. And instead what we have today is what we call digital sameness. You may have heard people use this term before, but if you think about any industry market segment and you look at, for example, the top 10 brands in that segment, what you will notice is that you will actually be hard pressed to find meaningful differences between them and their competitors, because everybody in these spaces, they're doing the same things. They're all surfacing the same customer problems. They are essentially designing almost identical customer experiences, which are invariably rendered on similar common form factors, and which are powered typically by similar technology stacks that run on industry standard processes. So we're at a place where, sure, digital might still be the only game in town. You still have to invest in digital, but because of this pervasive digital sameness, what is happening is that the differential impact of every incremental dollar that you spend on digital in creating, digital differentiation for yourself, it's been, steadily trending downwards. And now when you look at the future, with all of the enhancements in technology and AI and machine learning, it's quite obvious that the next leap for digital technology is towards embedded intelligence, towards AI and machine learning and hybrid workforces that combine humans and automation. But here's the thing, is that AI and machine learning doesn't exist on its own, right? It needs a scaffolding within which to embed itself into real world processes, into actual work. And process automation is, in a sense, that scaffolding within which to embed this intelligence and to foster innovation. And that itself kind of has its own breakaway value, which people are starting to realize. And I know this may sound a little abstract, but I want to illustrate it by sort of giving you an example, right? So if you think about Amazon as a company, Amazon has had a lot of experience in this space because for the last 10 odd years, they've been running this pervasive automation program, which was called Hands Off the Wheel. And this program was really targeted at automating any kind of work that could be automated, independent of what technology, whether it was AI and machine learning, or whether it was just re-architecting the process, or whether it was using a digital workforce. And that's great. You would imagine that they would have had a lot of cost savings, fair enough. But what was really interesting about the way that Amazon went about doing this was that they really, while they were running Hands Off the Wheel, they were also running this parallel program for reskilling and up-leveling their employee base. So a lot of the people, a lot of their employees who were in operational jobs and then got moved away from that and displaced essentially because of the automation that came into their roles, they were able to then choose skill paths and career paths and up-level themselves so that they moved away from some of these basic roles and started performing higher level jobs that were more focused on invention and on innovation. And that, well, the punchline of that story is that eventually these employees, some of them went on to create some of the most interesting innovations that we've seen come from Amazon in recent years. One example that you'll really enjoy is, the Go stores, the contactless checkout stores where you just walk in and pick up whatever you need and just walk out. Those were conceptualized, architected, and built by some of these employees who were at some point in their career in Amazon displaced from their jobs because of the Hands Off the Wheel program. So really, what Amazon was able to do, and I think what every organization today can possibly do, has the potential to do, is to rethink the way automation fits into its transformation and its innovation goals, and to really move away from operations and execution and redeploy its people, its effort, and its focus towards more invention and innovation than operations.
It's very interesting, Leslie. You mentioned about the Amazon Go and the importance of, especially in the retail and supply chain, the dynamic reallocation and the role of digital CFO, right? I think that is very clear how automation has played a very key role there, right? In the start of the conversation, you mentioned very interesting about how, RPA versus automation. And we know that we are at the ecosystem where we have seen RPA, the robotic process automation, intelligent process automation, and business process automation, right? What next in automation, right? How can automation accelerate like true digital outcomes, right? Especially in the context of the experience journeys that we talked about, not just the end customers, but internal stakeholders, vendor partners and employees and such.
That's a good question. So if you think about it, the last wave of disruption was caused by digital natives. I spoke about that. And I've also kind of hinted at the fact that the next stage of disruption will be caused by organizations that are automation native. These organizations will be, in a way, autonomous enterprises, right? Whose operating models are enabled by self-aware, self-correcting, self-directed digital technology with AI and automation at their core. Now, if you think about where we are today, we've gone through a few cycles. RPA became intelligent automation or intelligent process automation, which you can argue we've identified it as being a composite of 19 odd technologies, but you can also argue that intelligent automation fundamentally is RPA with embedded AI and machine learning here and there, but in very specific sort of use cases. But then, if you think about how we will get from here, where we are today, to this idea of the autonomous enterprise and automation-based disruption, I think it's important to think about it as follows, right? So we are today at the very base of what is a technology cycle that may possibly last for the better half of the next decade. And some of the trends that we are seeing, like, for example, the evolution from RPA to IPA and beyond, they are indicative of this broader shift that is happening from a technology point of view. So if you think about it from a demand side and from a supply side. So if you think about the demand side, there is a greater willingness for leading executives across companies to look at automation as not just a tactical thing that you throw into the back office and forget about, but really people are starting to question how this will link up to their broader goals and continue to keep them competitive as organizations. Like, for example, and this might be a little surprising to folks, but back in February 2020, when the pandemic was still a dark cloud in the horizon, we did a survey, a digital process automation survey, where we spoke to decision makers and asked them, why do you automate? We expected that a lot of them would be automating because of cost, and indeed about 15% did say that they were automating to save cost. But then 37% of these executives said that they were automating because they wanted automation to help them accelerate digital transformation. So there's a very palpable desire among executives for automation to be more than just something tactical or something just non-strategic. But then that's one angle, which is the demand side. If you look at the supply side, some really incredible things have been happening on the supply side, right? So if you just look at the kind of M&A that has been happening in the automation market, and I'm not specifically talking about RPA, but in a broader sense, the entire market, it's been on a complete tear. RPA companies have been getting bought over by digital process automation companies, low-code companies have been buying up AI companies. It's, there's just been this crisscross of, I actually made a chart. I made a chart in June or July when I put out a report to kind of just track the acquisitions that were going on in this space and how they connected to each other. It was a spider web of a chart. And the funny thing was that chart became obsolete 3 weeks after I put it out. That's the kind of feeding frenzy that's been going on in this space. And if you are willing to look past this frenzy, this M&A activity, and think about what actually it means from an automation point of view and in terms of the future of automation, then you start to see a few patterns, right? So, back in the day, which is kind of a year ago or maybe two, all these multiple automation technologies that used to kind of exist in their own sort of silos in terms of who buys them, how they get deployed and used, they had started to converge and to kind of weave into each other. And they were starting to form something that I'm today calling an automation fabric, which is something that sits today essentially between an enterprise application landscape at the bottom and the users within an enterprise who come on top. So think customers, think employees, think developers. And a lot of these technologies, they are kind of interweaving. Some of them you already see happening. So it's robotic process automation, it's DPA, maybe integration and iPaaS. In fact, I think the integration and process automation markets are turning out to be one of the first that are converging. But then you also have, microservices, low code software. You've got companies that are selling data and machine learning workflows, which are now increasingly getting embedded into process automation. You're seeing analytics, process intelligence, very interesting. All of these things are kind of colliding, weaving into each other, and that's really what's forming the fabric. And the convergence is really manifesting itself, interestingly, in even the applications that enterprises use. So, Ram, I think you and I had this conversation before, but remember how back in the day, there was this common argument against process automation that, it's just Band-Aid, and it's, enterprises will eventually modernize their application stacks and stop being so dependent on Band-Aid technologies like robotic process automation. Well, the fact is that if you really look at what the market is evolving into, almost every major ISV today, look at Microsoft or SAP or Salesforce, they themselves, as they evolve their products into kind of the next stage as they build out their product roadmaps, they are themselves building robust support for hybrid workforces and extensibility and citizen development into these roadmaps so that their software in the future, or even today in many cases, is effectively able to plug into the automation fabric. And I think this is key, right? Because the fabric itself kind of will eventually supersede RPA and IPA and whatever else. But over time, it will evolve into a kind of a layer that is able to intelligently orchestrate work between human workers and digital workers and AI agents, and maybe eventually even things like physical world assets like robots and the Internet of Things and so on. And I think that's to kind of come back to your question about where we are headed and where this is evolving. I think this is kind of the end game for the next decade or so, is that this is where this whole automation conversation is heading, and that's how it will become more and more core and fundamental to digital transformation, or the next stage of digital, as we call it.
That's awesome. So to look at the larger automation fabric definition, what I understand is that you have the ecosystem that is EDI, you have the API that are communicating through the traditional contracts, REST JSON type interactions, and then you have a whole bunch of enterprise applications. While the gaps exist in how the way the apps are communicating, and in order for us to be able to bring the user experience as the centerpiece, what we are saying is that automation fabric is the concept that weaves the all of those interfaces into a single ecosystem without having to have a custom integration built on top of it. Now that's the reason why the automation anymore is looked at as not just a bandage, but looked at as a long-term, the new trend of the world, right? That is very interesting, Leslie. Let's talk about automation fabric and how it can help enterprise to adopt, that experience-driven digital outcomes, right? Especially, when we talk about the experience, like the digital outcomes has got, quite a lot of aspects, right? Whether it is the channels, there are interactions, and there are different types of, target, customers and end users, right? How do you see that, automation fabric can help enterprise to adopt that experience-driven digital outcomes?
Interesting question. I think the best metaphor to think about is, if you use iPhones, you probably have this little app called Shortcuts. If you don't use iPhones, there are things out there, like there's a web app called IFTTT, which allows you to kind of plug together these, different APIs or different kind of, essentially this functionality where you don't really have to care about how the functionality gets created or how to integrate it. It's just drag and drop, and then you have a shortcut that you can interact with using, any of the voice assistants out there. And I think that metaphor is kind of a good description for where the enterprise is moving. I think that the future of the automation fabric and all of these convergences is going to create an environment where you can actually kind of interact with your applications as easily as you interact with your, some of the things on your mobile phone. So in a sense, think about it as the automation fabric coming and sitting in between your application layer and your users. And by users, that includes customers and creators and whatnot. And that's really going to be very interesting, because this becomes, therefore, your primary interaction medium for users to interface with your applications and to build apps and to build workflows and so on. So this entire paradigm, as it is forming today, and I think low-code and no-code software is a pointer in that direction, and it's definitely evolving towards that. But if you think about the implications of this change, right? So a few things hit you. The first is that as these tools and as the fabric kind of gets woven into the enterprise, you're going to see the emergence of a creator economy within every enterprise. So essentially, you'll have customers, you'll have employees, you'll have partners even, and you'll have a cross section of these kind of users. So you'll have people who don't want to have anything to do with creation, but then you'll also have citizen developers. semi-professional developers, business users, all of them kind of coming in and building applications and rolling their own workflows, creating their own applications. And with this, one of the very interesting things that will happen is that you'll see the shrinking of the distance between workers and their work, customers and experience. And through this, essentially what will end up happening is that you'll see a lot of time getting saved, so effort getting rationalized so that employees have more time to focus on higher order things. And this is really going to drive innovation right through to the grassroots of the organization, where work gets done. And so another implication of this is that it will also start to bring the focus back to employees and what they do. So in a sense, we've already established the link between EX and CX, employee experience and customer experience. And in a world where, we've talked about customer experience kind of dwindling in terms of its incremental return and value, it really comes down to your employees and how well they are, essentially they are brand ambassadors for your organization. So their interfaces with customers, and now by the way their interface is now enhanced by intelligence, machine learning and so on, they become even more critical, as your employees will not just be executors, but innovators and drivers of your organizational culture and brand ambassadors, essentially. So that becomes really important. And then this will, in some ways, even enable and actually maybe even force companies to start innovating across the value chain of their business, across front office, middle office, and back office. And then coming back to your point about experience, right? That's really interesting, because I think as we moved from maybe RPA to IPA, or everything that came in between, most of the low-hanging fruit kind of processes that existed within enterprises, they were disconnected from customers in a very real sense. Like you were talking about some back office finance process that really never impacted anybody except for once in a while, and was really a focus, really a source for cost, which you wanted to kind of weed out or prune or rationalize. And now once a lot of companies have started figuring out this RPA game and IPA game and have fixed their low-hanging fruit kind of processes, and then now they're looking upwards within the organization to search for processes with greater complexity and wondering how to automate them with all of these tools. I guess I need to mention here that the interesting thing about the automation fabric is that when we look at these higher order processes, the first thing that we realize is that no single technology, whether that's RPA or AI or something else, on its own individually is able to successfully automate these kind of higher order, more complex sort of processes. You need a combination, and more often than not, you need to supplement that with something like design thinking or process intelligence or something else that really gives you a sense of how the process actually gets executed as it gets laid across front, middle, and back office. And invariably, a lot of these organizations, these processes, they end up touching the customer either directly or maybe indirectly, in the sense that, customer onboarding, it's a complex process, but if any part of that process breaks or fails or is not able to deliver, then that has a direct impact on the customer's experience, and that creates the satisfaction and so on, right? And so I think one of my frustrations, and I wrote an entire report about it, with the way processes of such complexity get automated, is the fact that today you've got an entire discipline, which is called customer experience, which has over the decade or so of its existence, maybe more, invented these entire ways, these entire methodologies and processes and approaches to really measure customer interactions and the effectiveness and the emotions and everything aligned with that. And then you've got process folks, us who design processes, design automations, and these two worlds exist completely disconnected. And I think with the evolution of the automation fabric, and as automation becomes more and more higher order, it creates this very real opportunity for CX professionals and automation professionals to start joining forces and sitting across the table to design these complex processes, and maybe even in some cases reinvent them to create real customer value, breakaway digital differentiation through just the value of automation layered on top of CX technologies.
That's very interesting perspective, Leslie. And then I want to provide my point of view on what I heard from you as well as our experience, right? The key tenets for automation. So we are talking about digital native companies, a whole bunch of SaaS platforms that you're using, and you have companies that are transforming towards be a digital native. You have a whole bunch of ERP system, custom application, you have API management layer, and modern microservice API architecture, right? And on top of that, if you look at, you have collaboration platforms where you interact with your customers, your business users, your partners through chat apps platform, right? And then you have the channels, right? Additional channels, how you serve your customer, right? IVR, your mobile, web, and all of that, right? So if automation fabric, right? If you look at the key tenets of automation fabric, all of that, plus the most important is the centerpiece of that is the data, right? How data-driven integration can be the center pivot of automation is what we are looking at as the automation fabric that can weave all of that and bring ability for citizen developers, right? To bridge the gap between the work and the workers that you explained, right? That shrinking of the gap is what we are looking at as an automation fabric, right? That is very interesting perspective. I wanted to talk to Marcus about Workato, right? And how it fits the realm of automation fabric, given what we heard about automation fabric from Leslie and how it can bring digital outcomes and the channels and the key tenants, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So, and thanks for having us here. I mean, it's really fascinating to listen to you guys. It's maybe important to kind of go back and understand why we founded Workato and how Workato really came about. So if you think about, Vijay Tella, our CEO, he co-founded TIBCO, which is kind of one of the iconic integration companies, right? I worked with him at Oracle, but maybe more importantly, before I was actually a process consultant. So I was on the other side. And really what we realized is, it was interesting when Leslie mentioned IFTTT, if this then that, right? We actually noticed, both of us coming together, we noticed there were these modern new things coming about for consumers. And we said, like, wouldn't it be amazing if we had something like IFTTT, but with the power of a TIBCO that enterprises could use? That was really the idea of how Workato came about. We obviously really believe in the convergence, right, of the spaces. I think automation fabric just perfectly describes what Workato is. If you think about this idea that you can access all your applications and then orchestrate key processes on top of them. And then those processes, because we're in an enterprise, right? They need to support complex scenarios. So there needs to be human interaction in there. Then you need to be able to include intelligence and AI. And then, we mentioned this before, we're going to get to sensors and business events and all of that stuff. So what we build is, based on that TIBCO, past a very strong, robust integration layer. It's based on APIs, but we have over 1,000 just pre-built connectors, for your SAP, for all your cloud systems like Salesforce, Workday, ServiceNow, and so on, and also for your data stores. And then on top of that is that layer of what we call at Workato recipes. These are the process flows. And they're actually kicked off by triggers. These are the business events. And then things like Workbot, for example, we leverage for human interactions in there. So think of Workato as the heart, the orchestration engine of the automation fabric.
Absolutely. Having heard automation fabric, and very recently we were part of a conference where I heard integrated automation, right? I can see how the way how Workato has evolved towards that, from iPaaS towards and more like automation fabric with all those key tenants and all those connectors, right? Absolutely, spot on, Marcus. On the looking at the current, the way how Workato is being used currently, right, and the future roadmap, right? How do you see all of that aligns with the key tenets of automation fabric, like we talked about?
No, absolutely. I mean, first of all, there's many things that actually align, but let me highlight three. So the first one is that I believe where automation comes from in the past is, as we discussed, is kind of this more tactical approach in the back office, right? And here we're, with you guys, PK and so on, and we're talking about experiences, and those don't happen in the back office. They happen in the front office. We're talking about real innovation, not just cost savings, and this is what Workato is all about, because we have like very robust process workflows that are based on APIs and so on, and we can handle big amounts of data because of our integration legacy, right? And then we have these event triggers and AI. Workato is just a very strong platform for innovation, not for tactical automation. So that's number one. Number two, which was really, really important for us, power and so on, that's key in the enterprise, but it's not enough. What we've seen, what we really liked about IFTTT was that simplicity. Just making it easier, getting more people involved in that game of automating. And so the low-code aspect was very, very important to Workato. For me as an ex-process consultant, I just wouldn't like a platform that a process consultant couldn't interact with or iterate with, right? I mean, it can't be a black box. It can't just be for developers. It's got to be for everyone. And so we wanted to make it very frictionless. That's why we made it cloud native, first of all, but then the low code aspect that is key and will always be key for Workato. And maybe last but not least, we fundamentally believe that whole idea of the automation fabric. So there's got to be best of breed tools coming together, and so Workato is very, is built in a way that we facilitate those integrations. So we have connectors to RPA tools. We have connectors to low-code app development tools. We have connectors to process mining tools, and we think that is just how any part of that automation fabric needs to play.
Absolutely. Thank you, Marcus. I think for the benefit of the audience, I wanted to quickly talk about what are the use cases and business case studies where Workato can be applied, as well as any automation fabric, right? And then if it's okay, I'm going to take a lead on this and talk about a specific example where we have implemented, with Workato, as well as where we have done some custom implementation, right? Marcus, you brought us, into this whole ecosystem of home care assistants, right? One of the largest home-based care, provider platform. And when we looked at their ecosystem, one of the biggest challenges, the data, the high volume data, right? Not as a challenge as in the way how businesses, but that's how the large businesses are, right? And if you take, any large businesses aggregator like Uber or Google, Maps and all of that, right? You're dealing with the high volume data, right? In this case, their biggest challenge was that we have data coming in from Snowflake and, high volume, data sources, right? But we still want to be able to automate, right? Everything from invoice processing and front office, back office experience, right? Order generated all the way till, customer experiences, users getting their, email about their notification about when the hospital appointment or the home care appointment and all of that, right? With the traditional automation would have been absolutely impossible, right? When we start looking at the specific use cases, we are able to create a recipe. And the beauty is we were able to create a recipe in much lesser time than how we would traditionally build any automation approach, right? Where we are able to bring the data aspects, the interface aspects, all of that automated and weaved into the whole automation fabric approach, right? With Workato, that was a beautiful use case there. Leslie, we talked about the one of our largest example of automation fabric, which is where we were implementing for a large retailer in the warehouse management, right? With focus on how we can bring, reduce the days in inventory, right? With the distribution center as one of the centerpiece. And as we noticed, right, how, the importance of being able to shrink that gap exists between the people and the and the platforms, the worker and the work, right? And that's where we created a human-centered approach for business users to be able to abstract all aspects of different interactions. And that's where all the channels, right? The RF scanner type devices channel, we talked about the integration with the large ERP systems, reporting platforms, right? To some extent, even some of the modern A-frames and robotic platforms as well, right? Where we are able to integrate, and more importantly, the users, the business users, the distribution center, floor employees don't have to be worried about the technology itself, and they're able to use that to automate their supply chain aspects, right? And the third interesting aspects is that what we are currently doing with Workato is that there is a sales lead qualification, right? A whole bunch of leads are there in Salesforce, and we want to be able to provide an experience to through chat apps, but drive the next best action, right? So it's not just, hey, give me the list of all the opportunities that are out there for this specific salesperson, but based on in the past history, based on the pattern, how the sales prospecting has been happened for this sales employee, perform analysis of variance. We use SageMaker integration into Workato, and we're able to show the difference on how the analysis of variance was done by the SageMaker in the whole context of recipes, right? And that actually proves we have a large volume ERP system, data, AI, machine learning, also the chat apps integration, right? As a complete automation fabric. Marcus, do you want to add any additional use case and examples from your experience?
Sure. Well, I mean, I think you got some really fun ones there, and some good ones where a lot of the different pieces come together. I'll start with saying that the reality is not fully there yet, right? I mean, most people aren't as enlightened by the automation fabric just yet. We're definitely making our way there. But I wanted to just tell you two customer stories where actually it kind of didn't start with automation fabric, and then while we worked with them, it actually gravitated towards the automation fabric. Interesting one is one of our customers, MGM, the media company. When they started, they definitely had something like the automation fabric in mind. They just couldn't express it, and it was driven by IT and developers. So they really started with first they thought like what they needed was API management, because everyone told them it has to be about APIs, and that's how modern automation and so on is done. So, well, they felt, well, we got to buy an API management tool. But obviously that comes with a lot of limitations. It's very developer centric, right? And it really doesn't get them fast enough, as you mentioned also, right, to where they want to be. And then working with us and just working through a couple of scenarios, they realized, oh, with Workato, I get the power of APIs, but at the same time, I get actually much more done in much shorter time. And so it really gravitated towards that automation fabric. They understood that it's not just about API, it's about these processes at the end of the day. API is just a component of it. And so that was an interesting one, kind of showing like if you come from the very technical side, right? How do you go through that change to the automation fabric? I think there's the other side also. We worked with Hitachi Capital in the finance department. They actually owned an RPA tool. So when they did some process improvements and wanted to do them, the first thinking was like, oh, well, that's perfect for RPA. We're going to do this with RPA. And then they were digging in. They were doing process mining. They were really thinking a little broader. They thinking about innovation, and so they realized, well, if we bring this external data service in there, it's going to really make a big difference. Oh, and if we use AI, just in the case that you explained, we can make it even better, and so on. And then more and more they kind of explored. It felt, well, how are we going to make this happen with RPA? And then one of our partners actually showed them Workato, and it was natural. It let them include the AI steps, the data service that was a connector, that was no problem. So they kind of gravitated towards that more, away from the tactical side to the more strategic digital innovation side. So that's interesting. It's kind of the more if you come from the other side, from the business side, right? You know, how do you gravitate towards the automation fabric? But I can't do this webinar without talking about one of my favorite ones, actually, which is, you know, you probably get my accent. I'm from Germany. That's where I grew up. And so Deutsche Bahn, the German railway, and this is the Deutsche Bahn Cargo, their logistics arm, I think they just did such an amazing job, which I don't think they knew they would build an automation fabric, but I think they probably built the best one that I've seen so far. It's really, and this is because it's not just Workato. Yes, Workato is the orchestration engine, but then they use something like OutSystems for the low-code app development part. They use a RPA tool called LeapWork, where they connect to their IBM mainframe. So it's really an end-to-end low-code stack. And they really saw some tremendous speed improvements. They just onboarded a new car factory in Germany in 5 weeks, which was just unheard of. The whole data flow. They brought in a blockchain-based container tracking system and so on. Some really cool stuff in, you know, what you would think is you know, a very old school kind of company. So I think it shows the potential, what is possible if you bring multiple pieces together.
That's an amazing story. And especially the way how you mentioned about the automation fabric by including several, you know, low code, no code, but driving the digital outcome. That was amazing. I'm going to wrap up the session with one last question for Leslie. Leslie, what is your advice for enterprise customers, right? Looking at, you know, that whole experience-driven digital transformation for their customers, right? Giving that experience as a centerpiece, what would be your advice?
Yeah, I've been really enjoying listening to some of the examples that you guys have thrown out there. And it's, you know, if you think about this concept of where automation fabric should be and what it is becoming, it's a few things are increasingly clear, right? So one is that automation is indeed the fabric for digital business. Increasingly, you know, as we go through this cycle of evolution, for most people, employees, partners, customers, you know, the automation will be the primary application that they either create or interface with in order to get stuff done for themselves, either, you know, get work done, or if you're a customer, reach the things that you need to reach. And as a result, it has certain implications on sort of how this will play out, right? So first of all, you have to understand that as we go through, and I think your examples made it increasingly clear, is that you know, your processes, where do they sit? They weave through and sit on your automation fabric. Your applications, how do they express themselves to your end users? They express themselves as functionality. Your retail example that you gave was pretty interesting, because we all know that the distribution and warehousing environment is so complex, and you really have to be, you know, up on your game as far as the applications are concerned. Well, now that isn't a factor, because your primary interface now becomes the fabric. And as we go forward, as we continue to move through the evolution of this process, remember what I said, right? That this is easily a decade's worth of a technology cycle that we are at the very early stages of. So we are yet to see things like the fabric kind of starting to orchestrate in a more comprehensive sort of way human-machine interactions, you know, getting injected with intelligence. We've seen hints of it. It's pretty much started now, but that's got to, you know, go a long way before. Another thing that is interesting is the fact that the fabric will, as we go forward, offer new forms of creation and engagement. So for example, you know, I see a lot of resonance between conversational AI, which has grown frighteningly good over even the last 18 months. Kind of, why can it not be a primary creation layer or an interaction layer with the fabric? And then as we go forward, you know, more and more real world use cases will start to plug in to the fabric. And when I say real world, I mean the physical world. So for example, today we don't have robotics or IoT or sensors really well embedded within within process workflows. But as the fabric becomes a reality, and as kind of just the cloud robotics platforms and things like that become more and more integrated, and Marcus, you spoke about data, I think that's an important component of it. But as those things fold in, the ambit for automation suddenly expands so dramatically in the direction of the real world, right? So for example, today you can't create a process on a low-code tool that ends up in a robot flipping a burger somewhere. But tomorrow, who knows, that might be a reality. And when you put all of these things together, coming back now to your question, is that what should we take away from it, and how do we prepare for this kind of future? And how do we thrive in this kind of future? I think every organization needs to take a long, hard look at its current automation plans and scope, and really rescope them for this future. Now, that means a couple of things. First of all, and I've said this in one of the reports that I wrote on this, is that it starts at the CEO. It's, the march towards the autonomous enterprise requires that CEOs and organizations leaders really start to think about automation and the autonomous enterprise as their moonshot. I've said this again and again in this last few minutes. But automation is the next phase of digital transformation. And just like, the last phase, we had losers, we had people who got left out in the cold. This phase will also have people who don't get this message, who don't really take it seriously, who don't look at automation and the autonomous enterprise as their moonshot, and they will get left out in the cold. So I think for leaders, it's really important to start thinking about this not as a tactical thing, but as something more strategic and in fact pivotal, vital to the success and the growth of your enterprise going forward. Which also means that you have to start then at a second level, a lower level, maybe start rescoping your automation plans and reconfiguring your fragmented automation initiatives into a broader, sort of a more comprehensive approach towards intelligence and automation. And then you also have to start thinking about it. So when you're rescoping, you obviously have to stop thinking about the guiding metrics as being cost-centric or effort-centric. You now have to say, and look, the reality is that automation has had a lot of benefits. I give you the example of Amazon. See how many benefits they were able to achieve at a strategic level in terms of innovation. But then when you start measuring the value of automation, most companies don't really think about it holistically. What we really need is a sort of a balanced scorecard approach that really looks at every single piece of impact that automation, that strategically inclined, strategically focused kind of automation is able to drive across the enterprise. And how do you kind of aggregate all of that value and really start looking at automation in the context of all of that innovation-led value that it creates, rather than just in terms of the most obvious things that come to you that you can kind of connect and calculate. Another thing that I think is important is to really create automation and data literacy across the organization, because part of the struggle that we have today is that when you say automation, half your employee base kind of turns the other way, because now it's about kind of, what are you taking away from me? My job, my ability to work. That's not the kind of conversation that most enterprises really need to have. It's really about kind of building a culture wherein employees not just support and sustain, but also are excited for automation and what it can do for them at a grassroots level, and how it can allow their jobs to change, and how it can make them more inclusive and more productive, and actually more kind of innovation drivers and brand ambassadors for the enterprise rather than anything else. And this also, finally, I guess, to round this off, it also means that companies need to start looking at automation and customer experience as kind of at the same pedestal, and they need to start connecting the dots between the technologies that you're implementing in the back and the middle office and the impact that it is creating for customers. It's really, I know very interesting examples of companies that are actually doing design thinking workshops and putting in a lot of effort to kind of craft automation that is really plugging into customer goals, or plugging into things like employee well-being. So there's an organization that has been, building out essentially bots, which are kind of helper personas to specific very high-end sort of employee roles in terms of the skills of the human employees, so that they almost become this digital buddy that kind of on a day-to-day basis supports these employees as they deliver really high-end customer experiences or do very high-end, intuitive or data-centric jobs that are of really high value to the organization. So I think it changes the perspective the framing that you put around automation. And I think that is one of the most important things that today's leaders can do, is to really think about automation as that driver for transformation, and then start to build into that so that they can head into this autonomous enterprise future.
Completely agree with you, Leslie. I think the key message there is that don't look at building your current process, defining your PDD based on what specific platforms out there. Look at all the aspects of that experience journey, front office, back office, all of that, right? And then see how you can bring a complete end-to-end coverage of those experience journeys that may not be traditionally built by the standard RPA platforms or IPA platforms or business process platforms, but look at how we can bring automation fabric that can weave all of those, right? And be able to focus on getting that customer experience and that experience driven digital outcomes. Thank you so much, Leslie and Marcus. With that, I'll turn it over to Ross for Q&A.
Thank you, Ram. And yes, with the time we have left, we want to be able to ask a few of the questions that have been submitted. Several questions have been around taking that next step from just basic, let's just use the term dumb robots, right, to a more AI-based approach. How do we get started moving from sort of level one automation toward a more intelligent-based automation approach? And whoever wants to answer that, please feel free.
I can start that. And so I think most important thing is that when we are looking at automation, the first and foremost perspective is that this is the current outcome expected. What is your future outcome that you expect? How do you want to improve that outcome from an experience standpoint? If you are able to map out, what experience, score that you are trying to drive on that process, you may be able to find out the process itself might have to be changed, right? So bring the right level of changes to the process so that you are ready to start looking at how you can bring, all of those changes with the automation as a centerpiece, number one. Second is that, like we talked about, right, the most important aspect is that if you want to go from RPA to a truly automation fabric or intelligent automation, the bots will have to have the ability to provide the humans the next best action. For that, you need to have the right level of data and right level of AI and machine learning algorithms that can process the data and provide meaningful information that will drive the business user to make the next best action. So I think that is some of the key aspects of that, right? And then the third thing is that looking at how do you message it across the entire organization. I think like what Leslie mentioned, it's very important how you message your organization, right? Automation is not just a bandage. Automation is looked at as not from a cost saving standpoint, but more importantly, the value that automation is being able to bring from driving customer experience as well as user experience, right? I think that messaging and that the strategic leader of the organization that is driving automation and how it is being messaged to the rest of the organization plays a very key role.
I think what we've learned working with customers, it's actually really interesting. I think once you make the shift from thinking of processes as something just repetitive, something in the back office, something monotonous almost that you just always walk through, and then you switch your perspective to being a little more analytical and think about like, well, what is the exception when something should happen? It's like, you not just like I do this every day at 8 a.m., but like also what is the event when I need to do a certain flow? Then I think you're on the path to making this more intelligent, and you're on the path to including AI at the end of the day. I mean, we have this really interesting customer, Hubspot. You guys might know Hubspot. They're like CRM software for small businesses. And so we work with their customer success organization. I think is really interesting from an experience perspective. HubSpot has so many customers. they could just never have enough customer success representative. It's impossible. So you can't even think of it as a repetitive process, as a monotonous process. They need to listen to, so which one of my 400,000 customers am I gonna really focus on this week? And for that, you need analytics. You need to infuse analytics into the process. You need to make it data-driven. You might actually start with like very basic, just SQL queries, right? But then the more and more think about it, the more and more you refine it, I think you're going to end up with an AI model. It's almost inevitable. But yeah, I think it really starts from being a little more analytical driven. Sometimes you're forced into that situation, but think about exceptions and business events and don't think about just monotonous processes.
Yeah, I think if I can just quickly, I know we're out of time, but quickly add to it. I think Ram, you and I have spoken in the past about one of your customers who had started looking at automation opportunities all the way from the balance sheet down, right? And then we've had similar examples where I've run into customers who have been doing similar things, but kind of also bifurcating processes into kind of cost-focused processes and innovation-focused processes, which is another way of thinking about it. But just starting from the top and rethinking how the business is done is one way to kind of, so top-down is another way to look at it.
Fantastic, thank you. And it is time. And so I think with that, we want to thank everyone for joining us today for this conversation. Obviously, we weren't able to get to all of the questions that were asked, so feel free to reach out directly to any one of the panelists with your questions. I'm sure they'd be really grateful for the opportunity to respond to you. Thank you again. Have a great day, everybody. Thanks for joining us for a conversation around automation as the new fabric.